if China did try to even threaten to do such a thing, I think that they would rebuff them. But like I said, I don't think that it's in China's interest to be seen doing such a thing. And I'm not trying to say that China is not willing to use its economic power or its economic leverage to lean on countries in situations where it believes that it would work or that it would be to its benefit to do so. You're absolutely right that it's sort of like America imagines that, well, this is how we would handle the situation. But China's entire regional strategy is based on drawing a contrast between its behavior in the US. And again, it's not to say that China doesn't use economics as leverage to the detriment of some of its allies at times. It's just that it tends to do so in a much more conservative, risk-averse, and less overt and heavy-handed way.
China's got a stake in this, and if they just sit on the sidelines and say it's America's fault, it's Israel's fault, blah, 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 well, you know what? Great. Suffer when the oil prices shoot up. Suffer when your ships can't get through, as is the case in the Red Sea, where even Chinese ships now have come under attack. Great. You're on your own. Good luck. I mean, there's more at stake here than just politics and rhetoric for the Chinese.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica podcast network. I'm Eric Olander in Saigon. Well, it was a quiet weekend after Israel's counterattack against Iran for its counterattack against Israel in retaliation for the Israeli airstrike on the Iranian embassy in Syria a few weeks ago. Everybody's been holding their breath that what we've been seeing over the past couple of weeks between these two countries isn't going to turn into a full-scale war that will engulf the entire region. But one of the more fascinating aspects of all of this is how the United States is once again calling on China to do more to use its influence with Iran to discourage the leaders in Tehran against further retaliation. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should. Literally within 24 hours of Hamas's attack on southern Israel last October, senior U.S. leaders have repeatedly called on the Chinese to try and persuade the Iranians to rein in Hamas. Later it was the Houthis, and now it's the Iranians themselves. You might remember that all this began on October 8th, when U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping and put the president on the spot in front of live TV cameras, calling on him to urge Iran to do something to curtail Hamas. Now, based on what we know now, Xi basically ignored Schumer's request, and then Foreign Minister Wang Yi did the same a few months later when U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan made the same appeal, and this pattern has gone on for months. Just last week, as the missiles started flying between Israel and Iran, U.S. officials once again started surfacing the idea that China should do more to influence Iran. This is what gets me so puzzled. I don't understand why they think it's going to work today when it hasn't worked for the past 6 months. Some people say there's a strategy here. Other people seem to think that this is just another example of folks in Washington misreading how much influence China actually has in Iran. So I wanted to find out what's going on. And to do that, I called on our old friend of the show, Bill Figueroa, who's an assistant professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands and one of the world's leading scholars on Sino-Iranian relations. Bill, great to have you back on the show again. I've been looking forward to speaking with you about all of these dramatic events that have been unfolding in the region. Wonderful to catch up again.
Oh, great to be here as well. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, the last time we had you on the show, we were talking about the post-October 7th China reaction to the events there. And if you recall in that discussion that we had, you remember Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was in Beijing at the time, and he launched a surprise request on Chinese President Xi Jinping in front of the TV cameras, asking for Xi to put pressure on Iran in order to influence Hamas. This then led to a number of similar requests by the administration, including National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, made that request. Apparently, it came up even in the Biden-Xi meeting in San Francisco, and it's happened at multiple layers of the U.S. government, putting requests onto the Chinese to use their leverage with Iran. This issue has surfaced back up this week. Let me read you a couple of headlines just from the past few days. So this is the Wall Street Journal. Western governments press Beijing to use its influence with Russia, Iran. On National Public Radio, they said U.S. wants China to use its influence with Iran to calm tensions in the Middle East. CNN, which you were quoted in this story, they had a headline, "Can China play a role in avoiding an all-out war in the Middle East?" Now, you wrote on X a really insightful Twitter thread, and I copied the whole thing. It was so great, and I put it in our daily newsletter. I put the whole thing there. And there was one line in there that I really liked, and I'd like you to give me your take on all of this. On paper, you said China has leverage over Iran. It has substantial economic investments in trade relations, provides security and surveillance equipment, and is the main purchaser of Iranian oil. In practice, it is difficult, though, for China to pull these levers to influence Iran's behavior. Okay, there's the yin and the yang there. On the one hand, we've got these demands coming from the U.S. On the other, scholars like yourself are saying, it's not going to happen. What is going on here?
Well, one thing I could say, letting the historian in me speak first, is we often say if you're studying historical issues, especially this is true in China, the more frequently you see a law being passed or a request being repeated in a historical record, you might think that that tells you that there's a great deal of focus on that issue. But what it often tells you is that there's a great deal of trouble actually getting that issue over the line. And I think that's what you're seeing here. These repeated requests by the U.S. government are a good indication of how difficult of a time they're having getting the Chinese to actually respond in any sort of appreciable way. And there's a couple of reasons for that. When I say that it's difficult for China to pull these levers, what I primarily mean is that it's not particularly in their interest. And it's not really on the list of things that they agree with on the United States. So it's really a question of, I think, goals versus methods. Both the United States and China are on the same page with regards to things like, should there be regional escalation, or should, even in terms of Iran's nuclear program. What they disagree on is the degree to which Iran should be kind of coerced or pressured through these kinds of more strong-arm sort of methods to achieve those results. And also, they disagree on the question of what is the root cause of all of the escalation and all the tensions that we're seeing. So on the one hand, they don't believe that it's really Iran that needs to be pressured. They believe that it's Israel that needs to be pressured because they see Gaza as the root cause of all of this escalation and all of the potential for a wider regional war. They've made it quite clear that they believe that if the siege in Gaza ended and if a final political two-state solution was found for the Palestine issue, then you wouldn't even have these problems. And to that respect, it's quite clear, it's almost like turning the accusation back around on the United States that, no, it's not us that should be pressuring Iran, it's you that should be pressuring Israel. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that the actual influence that Iran has on China, it's not small, but it is certainly smaller than the United States, or at least the Western media tends to portray it.
So why are they misreading this? Does Jake Sullivan in the White House not have the intelligence coming into him that says basically what you're saying, what Jonathan Fulton at the Atlantic Council is saying, what any number of scholars who look at this, who have been saying not just for weeks and months, but for years, that China's leverage with Iran is nowhere near as significant as they think it is? Why is this not getting through to these very high-level stakeholders who have access to enormous amounts of very expensive intelligence?
Well, I don't want to pretend that I can read minds, but my opinion, honestly, is that I think they know. And I think they have other reasons for wanting to very publicly put this question to China. First of all, it kind of gives the impression of the United States taking every potential option that it has on the table, and leaving no stone unturned and looking for all the possible ways that they could keep the situation under control and be seen as a peacemaker, basically. And that's really important because right now the United States is not seen as a peacemaker by most people in the region or around the world. And their support of Israel during the Gaza conflict has caused a great deal of problems for them in terms of their diplomatic strategy. So it helps them to sort of put forth the image of we're trying everything that we have in our power short of ending our support for Israel, which is politically, difficult. That being said, I also think that it's a little bit of, like I said before, the Chinese are kind of turning that accusation back on the US. Well, what is the accusation? The implicit accusation is that China is either unwilling or unable to actually be a player in the Middle East in the way that it has been portraying itself to be over the last few years. So I think it's really, I don't want to say it's a propaganda effort, but it has more to do with imaging and messaging, I think, than it does with the United States actually thinking that China is going to be able to put pressure on Iran. And if they happen to do so, that would just be a bonus for the United States. But I don't think they think it will.
Right. So let me see if I understand what you're saying here. And you're, by the way, not the only one who said this, that maybe part of the strategy is a conscious effort to expose or to reveal that China may not be as influential in Iran as everybody thinks it is. And by extension, maybe that it dispels and takes the air out of this narrative that China is displacing the United States, in fact, as the major power in the Middle East, which is, again, something that's been propagated by Gulf and Arab stakeholders themselves, not just by others looking in, but by actually showing that the Chinese are only interested in a much more narrow set of interests and not interested in regional peace and stability and not willing to use their purported leverage, then it exposes them for being effectively a paper tiger. That's the idea.
Yeah, I think that's what the United States thinks they're doing. I think actually, though, if you look at the Chinese response, I think they've actually quite effectively have a good answer to that, which is basically to say, no, it's not that we don't care about peace and stability. It's that we don't think that this is the way to attain that. Like I said, they've been very clear they think that Israel's the root cause. And they've also been very clear that in this particular situation, their sympathies lie with the Iranian for some very obvious reasons. The root cause is an attack on an Iranian embassy, which obviously echoes the sort of 1999 Belgrade embassy bombing in China, which raises all sorts of kind of nationalist sympathies. But also, they've said to the Iranians, Wang Yi basically told Abdulhamian, that thank you basically for not escalating any further. That they appreciate that Iran's response was more or less showing more restraint, at least than by comparison when you look at like Israel's response to Gaza. There were no civilian casualties. They mostly attacked military targets. And they've now said that the matter is closed and that they don't intend to escalate any further. Although there was an Israeli strike that was launched just a few hours ago. So we'll have to see. But I think I saw one Iranian general was asked what's Iran's response going to be to this latest attack. They've said you've already seen Iran's response, which implies that they're not going to launch another attack. So I think that in this particular case, they very clearly care about escalation into a wider war and peace and stability in the region. But I don't think that they think that pressuring Iran is going to get them anywhere on that subject. They're much more worried about Israel and Israel's response and Israel's ongoing war in Gaza.
Well, let's put this more bluntly. Let's say that the Chinese did want to pressure Iran. Would Iran accede to Chinese requests? So even if they wanted to, which apparently they don't, but even if they did, does Iran take direction from China on security issues? And does this question of the economic leverage of buying up 90% of Iranian oil translate into political and security influence?
I would say no. There's a degree to which it does translate to influence, but not on these types of issues. Let me put it this way. If China were to say that they're going to cancel all deals with Iran, I think that would honestly hurt China and its reputation in the region more than it would hurt Iran. To be clear, if they completely stopped buying Iranian oil forever, that would be a devastating blow to Iran. But it's very clear that, they wouldn't do such a thing. So, that's completely a non-starter. So in terms of the things that they are willing to do, even if it were, say, temporarily suspending oil sales as they've done in the past, no, I don't think that Iran would respond favorably to that for a couple of reasons. One, it's a really important, it wouldn't look well internationally or domestically to be seen acquiescing to Chinese pressure in that way. Relations with China are already quite controversial in Iran, partially because the Chinese government has not followed through with a lot of the investment that they promised to Iran. So there is a little bit of tension within the relationship as well. So it's not like they have this direct line of communication or a great deal of sway in terms of the Iranians are completely positively disposed towards the Chinese right now. And in addition to that, there's just the simple fact that, they have in the past, at least allegedly, tried to put a little bit of pressure on Iran, for example, to change its policy toward the Houthis or to use its influence with the Houthis in some way. And that didn't seem to have any result whatsoever. Indeed, they've been pressuring Iran for years to come to the negotiating table and talk to the US about restoring the JCPOA, because the number one priority for China is the removal of the sanctions, which would allow for further investment. So they actually want Iran to have a closer relationship with the US, and for various reasons, Iran has not taken that direction. So I think that you could come up with an imaginary scenario in which China throws all of its economic leverage onto Iran, but I don't think it's going to happen. And even if it did, I think that the Iranians would rather kind of try to ride out the storm than to be seen to completely acquiescing to it. That being said, they do match their behavior to a certain extent to what China desires, right? In the sense that they do take this into account. If you read Iranian newspapers, they talk about how certain actions have upset the Chinese and that that's something that needs to be taken into account. But it's certainly not the case that, especially on matters of security and things that are considered to be, of high level of importance, that they're going to be taking orders from Beijing. No, I don't think so at all.
Well, we just got some new numbers from the Iranian oil sector. It looks like they're now exporting record amounts of oil, $35 billion a year, about 1.56 million barrels a day, 90% of which apparently goes to China through intermediary countries, most of it passing through countries like Oman and Malaysia. In fact, Malaysia exports more oil to China than it produces every year. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy in the Malaysian numbers there, and a lot of people say that's just transshipments coming from Iran. So in Washington, there is this widely held perception that all of that oil flowing to China does give it the economic leverage that can then be translated into political leverage. And one of the points that I was thinking, inspired by a lot of the things you've been saying, is that Americans think in this very transactional way. It's a very Trumpian way of thinking and seeing the world. And that's how we oftentimes think of it. But that's not necessarily the way the Iranians think of things, in part because they've been under sanction now for decades, brutal sanctions from the international community. And so the idea of China's going to pressure them on core national security interests, particularly related to Israel, my reading of it, and I'm nowhere near as expert in this as you are, is that they would brush the Chinese back and say, the mullahs would say, listen, stick to oil and economics, but these national security issues, that's a separate realm. We're not going to take guidance from you on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to remember that a lot of that oil is going to private Chinese refineries, that it's actually quite difficult.
The teapot refiners.
Yes, exactly. And it's actually quite difficult for China itself to put a stop to that sort of thing, because those refineries are doing that because it's a way to bolster their bottom line at a time when they're facing a lot of economic pressure. So there's that issue. And then, yes, I agree with you. I think if China did try to even threaten to do such a thing, I think that they would rebuff them. But like I said, I don't think that it's in China's interest to be seen doing such a thing in such a, and I'm not trying to say that China is not willing to use its economic power or its economic leverage to lean on countries in situations where it believes that it would work or that it would be to its benefit to do so. But in this, you're absolutely right that it's sort of like America imagines that, well, this is how we would handle the situation. But China's entire regional strategy is based on drawing a contrast between its behavior in the US. And again, it's not to say that China doesn't use economics as leverage, to the detriment of some of its allies at times. It's just that it tends to do so in a much more conservative, risk-averse, and less overt and heavy-handed way. And I don't think that you would see that level of weaponizing of the oil issue, so to speak.
Yeah, I was talking to a Chinese think tank analyst last week, and he said something very interesting. He said, you know what, we tried to use economic leverage to persuade Australia, and they went hard after Australia. They banned entire categories. They cut off student exchanges. They cut off bauxite sales or trimmed bauxite sales. They also cut wine, tourism, and it had no impact, no meaningful impact on Australia's policies. They tried the same with Lithuania. No real impact on Lithuania because of its positions on Taiwan. So Chinese economic coercion at this level of cutting off these sanctions haven't actually proven to be that effective when they do it. And so that may be one of the factors. The other thing that he brought up, and I'd love to get your take on this, is that if China was asserting itself to change Iran's national security priorities for whatever reason, that brushes up very closely to the non-interference doctrine, that they don't like to get involved in other countries' decisions like that at that level, particularly at the behest of the United States in this current moment that we're in. So he said for a number of reasons, this is a non-starter in Beijing, this idea.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's important to remember that the Chinese intellectual and strategic community is pretty united in its view that not only has the United States shot itself in the foot by acting the way it has over the last few decades in the Middle East, but also that is a source of a lot of America's comparative weaknesses and a source of Chinese comparative advantages. The reputation of the U.S. that it has acquired, and even just this idea of, in a very simplistic way, the U.S. being depicted as the destroyer, the nation that comes in and uses its power and, to start wars and to support wars and throw its weight around, and then to compare to China as the builder, the one that comes in to rebuild after those wars, to build up the country's economies. That's been extremely effective for China. And again, it's like you say, China is a country like any other. It will use its power in its own interest as much as it can. But it's really this doctrine of non-interference, it's not that it's the Chinese state is unwilling to ever get involved, but it certainly is a deterrence against it getting involved in situations like this, where it very clearly would tarnish China's reputation and would not likely to be very effective.
Okay, well, let's go back to Capitol Hill, because last week, the House passed some new legislation that would impose further sanctions against Iran, and part of it is that they want to make it more difficult for the Chinese to purchase Iranian oil, and they want to try and pressure the White House to enforce the embargo so that China is not, what they say, this is their words, not mine, funding terrorism and funding the attacks on Israel, both the direct attacks and also Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon, that, again, a lot of people on Capitol Hill believe is being facilitated by Chinese oil sales. The president, interestingly enough, is in a very difficult position, because if he puts the fleet at the mouth of the Straits of Hormuz, number one, he threatens a confrontation with Iran, which is not necessarily something that he wants. But number two, he potentially is going to antagonize China. And he's also going to add to higher fuel prices and potentially boost the cost of goods coming from China to the United States because of higher oil prices that would ensue from actively boarding Iranian ships to stop Iranian oil from going to China. Much more contentious. So they're saying that Biden, he's caught between Congress and the Chinese and the Iranians on this. What about the politics of enforcing this embargo that the United States ostensibly has against Iranian oil making it out, and cutting the Chinese off from that supply?
Yeah, it's pretty obvious to me that this embargo has existed for more than 20 years, I think, at this point. I shouldn't say this as a historian, but sometimes I'm not great at dates, so maybe it's a little bit more, a little bit less.
Decades.
We'll
just say
decades.
At
least decades, and they've never, ever been able to effectively enforce it. The only time that China has stopped importing Iranian oil is when they've decided to do so as a result of, U.S. pressure temporarily. And even in those cases, it often, after the fact, is exposed that what happens is the imports officially drop to zero. But that doesn't mean that they stop going through entirely. So I think that the politics of it are bad enough for all the reasons you just laid out, but the logistics of it, I think, are even worse. Good luck without doing exactly what you described of actively setting up a fleet and,
No, that's the only way it would happen, is physically boarding those ships, which would be, I think, tantamount to an active war in the minds of the Iranians.
Absolutely. And I also think that they would, you have to remember, too, that people get very creative when you put that, things like that. And it's the propensity for ships to be flagged falsely or for other ways to get around even an embargo, it would be a nightmare. And I don't think that it's worth it for them to do so, at least in their eyes.
Yeah, that's the calculation that I was making, because right now, Biden is facing the Chinese in the South China Sea in a potentially very dangerous showdown. And one has to wonder, again, about picking your battles. Is it worth picking your battles here? Or, again, he's in a direct confrontation with the Philippines in the South China Sea and further antagonizing the China-U.S. relationship over something that, as you pointed out, has been happening for decades now, is critical. Okay, let's look forward a little bit here. We're in this situation now. We're now actively in a tit-for-tat between Israel and Iran. Israel came out very vocal and said they were disappointed in China's response to last weekend's attack. That was the first missile attack, the drone attack with 300. We have to keep track of these. They're happening at a pretty fast pace now. And then with the retaliation, and now at the time of this recording, we're hearing that Iran says they will not retaliate for the latest Israeli missile attack. But again, by the time this happens, it might have happened. How does China, in your view, manage what looks to be an escalating direct confrontation between Israel and Iran?
I think they're going to manage it the same way that they have tried to manage the crisis since the beginning, which is to continually offer and to actively meet with, their various partners. In this case, certainly the Iranians and the Israelis. I mean, Jai Jun met with the Israeli ambassador to China just a few days ago. So it's not like they've closed down communications on this issue. And I think they're going to stick to their line, which is that the root cause of the tension is the cycle of violence that's being perpetuated right now by Israel's siege in Gaza, and that without that cycle and with a final political settlement for the Palestine issue, you could see these problems put to bed. And I don't think that they're going to focus on pressuring their allies or deterring them against responding to any spillover damage that Israel does to them or their interests, because they don't see it as the root cause. But fundamentally, they don't have any levers to pull there. I mean, they don't have any real way to pressure Israel. And so I don't think they have any real way to keep things from spiraling out of control were they to do so. And I think that they're actually quite aware of that. Does China portrays itself as a major player and an important player, a rising player in the Middle East in terms of diplomatic and economic relations? China is not the one that's saying we are going to replace the United States in the Middle East. This is something that Western analysts are saying out of their fears and their reading of the situation. So I think China is going to take, the same sort of conservative approach that it's currently taking and just sort of portraying itself as a supporter of the international order and of peace and de-escalation, urging all sides to step back from the brink and offering, being willing to serve as some sort of common ground or meeting place that, these different groups could potentially have negotiations under the auspices of. I don't actually think that they would do that. I mean, if you've seen any real negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and the Arab states has happened under the auspices of the United States, which ultimately is the country that has the greatest amount of leverage on Israel. So I think that they would just sort of continue to do what they have done. Basically, the sort of responses that you've been seeing in the media and the way that they've been talking about the issue, I think that they'll stay the course.
Okay, I thought you were going to say that, so let me now put my hat on and channel my inner DC Beltway think tanker / policy hack in Washington and say,
"Oh, God save us all."
Okay, here let me just give you a rebuttal on this. Okay, so we got new numbers that just came out on Chinese oil imports. 11.3 million barrels a day of crude were imported to China in 2023. By the way, that is a record high of all time, up 10% over 2022. When we look at the top 10 sources of Chinese imported fossil fuels, guess what? 6 out of the 10 come from the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. We're looking at Iraq, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait. So the Chinese, this isn't an academic exercise for them. They have some skin in the game here. If the Middle East descends into a cauldron of awfulness, those 11.3 million barrels of oil, some of it, a large portion of it, and natural gas, by the way, are going to be a lot more expensive. And that is not something that a rather anemic Chinese economy has a lot of appetite for. So this idea that the Americans say, well, listen, China's got a stake in this. And if they just sit on the sidelines and say it's America's fault, it's Israel's fault, blah, 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 well, you know what? Great. Suffer when the oil prices shoot up. Suffer when your ships can't get through, as is the case in the Red Sea, where even Chinese ships now have come under attack. Great. You're on your own. Good luck. I mean, there's more at stake here than just politics and rhetoric for the Chinese.
Certainly. And I mean, this is why my point is the Chinese genuinely don't want that any more than the United States wants that, for all the reasons that you just described. It would be a disaster for their economy. It would be a disaster for all of the investments that they have already made in the region. It's just a simple matter that, like I said, they don't believe putting pressure on. For example, if they had done what the U.S. asked and pressured Iran not to respond in the way that they did, it's very clear that they don't think that that would prevent If, for example, let's say, Israel continues its assault on Gaza, or maybe another incident originating with Israel happens in the future, that's going to prevent the issue from spinning out of control. So as I said, it's not that they don't want that. It's that they don't think that what they have to offer on the crisis is economic and coercion of the actors involved. Let me put it this way. If they were buying 90% of Israeli oil and Israel was being under sanctions by the US or something along those lines, if they had true economic leverage over Israel, I wouldn't be surprised if that was something they were willing to use. Ultimately, I think that their answer to that would simply be, well, what about you? Why are you not using your ponderous leverage with Israel to finally put an end to all of this? And why are you pointing to China when you are the ones who are supporting Israel and supporting the war in Gaza and making it possible, basically, with shipments of weapons and diplomatic coverage? And you're the ones who are going to suffer, probably even more than we will in the long run. The other thing that's important to remember is that Iranian oil, while China is buying 90% of Iranian oil only makes up about 10% of China's overall imports. It has oil interests elsewhere in the world. So, it's not going to be without pain, but I don't think it's something it's not existential. The Middle East is an important part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's an important way to sort of, offshore unproductive assets and bolster the profits of various Chinese companies and provincial governments, but it's not the existential threat to the Chinese state that the Americans may think it is.
No, but $120 a barrel oil is. Right? Do you know what I mean? Like if the price goes up because of the instability.
No. I do agree with you on that. Like I said, I don't think that they believe that they have any ability to influence that to that degree.
So looking forward now in the near term, because we can't look medium or long term given how fast this situation is changing, should we expect any change in the Chinese rhetoric or their position on the conflict and specifically related to Iran, or is what we see now what we're going to get?
If the Iranian government were to continue to respond to Israel or to continue to pursue its own escalations, I wouldn't be surprised if you got wind of a little bit, at the very least, of the Chinese communicating their displeasure to the Iranians. And perhaps at some point in the future, you might see some deals being scuttled or some form of, of pressure being put on Iran by China. But we're certainly not there yet. And it's certainly not going to be the sort of massive canceling of all oil shipments or something of that nature. Simply because, like I said, I don't think the Chinese, it's not that they don't have the leverage, it's that they don't think that leverage is going to be effective. What is the benefit of them ending if they stopped it tomorrow? Would the war be over? Would the tensions de-escalate? Is Iran the only country that's potentially threatened by Israel and the war in Gaza, or the only country that's angry enough about it that it might retaliate if another strike were to happen on their embassies? I don't think so. And also, you have to remember that all of these organizations that are sometimes called Iranian proxies, they are not proxies in the traditional sense of established by Iran, funded by Iran, and unable to carry out their activities without the support of Iran. Their own organizations, the Houthis in particular, the connection with Iran, in my opinion, is often quite exaggerated and overblown. They have their own sources of income, their own sources of support. So I have to say that I sort of agree with the Chinese on that respect, that I don't think that Iran is the main problem here in terms of the potential threat in the future for the region spiraling out of control. I do think that the United States has a lot more leverage. It's just that they are also, for their own reasons, unwilling to bring it to bear.
So I was going to wrap up our conversation here, but I have one more question that just popped into my head that I really want to get your take on. So interestingly, that right after the Iran counterattack, when they launched the 300 missiles into Israel, Wang Yi got on the phone with both the Iranian foreign minister and the Saudi foreign minister. And he is desperately trying, in my view, to ensure that the March 2023 détente, that agreement that brought those two together, ending 7 years of diplomatic separation, that is the foundation of China's diplomatic push in the Middle East in many respects. Their credibility is predicated on this. And so when Wang Yi was speaking with both of those two foreign ministers on the day, it was my reading, and I'd love to hear what you think, that he was more concerned about that relationship holding rather than the broader crisis in the Middle East. And because if that relationship falls apart, then China's credibility takes a hit because they've put so much into this. How do you see that agreement? Do you see the strains, coming in? Because we hear that the Saudis, again, the Wall Street Journal reported this, but then others refuted it, that the Saudis gave intelligence to the Americans and the Israelis in advance of the attack. We've also heard that there is now growing strains and tensions between the Saudis and the Iranians, and Wang Yi really wants to try and keep those two together. Give us your read on the Saudi-Iran relationship as it relates to China.
Even after the normalization agreement, there remained tensions and strains between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And of course, anytime that Iran takes actions that bolster its position as potentially a regional hegemon or leader in the region in terms of opposing Israel's actions in Gaza, or even just, raising tensions in ways that potentially would be detrimental to the Saudi state, there's going to be conflict and there's going to be tension. What I can say is that as a result of that conversation that Wang Yi had both Saudi Arabia and Iran, they were all largely on the same page. I believe that the Saudi minister said something along the lines of that they trust China's approach, basically, and that they more or less signed off on what it was that China said about Iran, which is that, that Iran had fundamentally taken a fairly limited response, and that they had, to a certain extent, they had some right to respond to the attack on their embassy, and that the escalation on Iran's part was now effectively over. So at the very least, in terms of their response to the Chinese statement on that matter, the Saudis indicated that they trusted the Chinese, and they trusted their approach to that matter. So I would say that if the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia is going to fall apart again, it will be as much out of China's hands as was them coming together in the first place. As we talked about previously, China didn't make that happen. China played an important role in getting it over the line, but it happened for reasons that had to do with Iran and Saudi Arabia and their own reading of their interests. And I think that if the relationship comes apart, there's also probably not going to be much Beijing can do about it.
Right. Okay. So I hope you get the flack now from the Chinese trolls who listen to this show and always accuse me of saying things bad about China when I say the exact same thing that you just said there. So watch out. So, okay, Chinese trolls, it didn't come out of my mouth. It came out of Bill's mouth.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate that.
No, really. Every time we talk about this, I get flack on Chinese social media that I'm anti-China because I say exactly the same thing, that it basically was that the Omanis and the Iraqis did a lot of the heavy lifting in getting this deal over the finish line, and the Chinese kind of put the bow on it, and they think, why are you trying to undermine China? Like, no, that's not what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and I would say that, I don't think that's what I'm trying to do. I think that fundamentally, like I said, China played an important role there. It's questionable whether that deal would have been able to get over the finish line without China, but it's just important to maintain a realistic understanding of what's happening. Both from the perspective of the Chinese state, because I'm sure that internally China is well aware of what its actual capabilities are. But also, I'm also speaking partially, to the Western narrative of, China and Iran and Russia make up the axis of evil, and that they have this massive relationship that's hugely threatening to the West. To a certain extent, I'm not so much trying to downplay the significance of China's ability to be a player in the Middle East. It certainly is increasingly a player. It's just not the terrifying, all-powerful player that both Chinese nationalists and American nationalists and people who beat the war drum often like to portray it as.
Okay, well, that's a good place for us to leave the conversation. Bill, thank you so much, as always, for your fascinating insights. I think we could have a conversation for 3 hours, and I'm looking forward to bringing a bottle of wine to Holland and just really hashing through these. Bill Figueroa is an assistant professor of history and theory of international relations at the University of Groningen. Did I get that right?
Groningen.
Yeah,
close enough.
Man, that's not easy. But he is literally the Iran-China guy. And on X, that is where you can find him. And go look on his page and you'll see a thread. It's about an 8-part thread that he wrote last week right after, I think, the second or third round of attacks, and gave just some fascinating insights on this question of leverage. And so you've been quoted quite a bit throughout the media, and I think you're going to be continued to be called upon by journalists to help explain what's an incredibly complex topic. So thank you so much, Bill. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to talk to you.
It's great. And then Cobus will be back with me next week for another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, check us out at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and hopefully you can support the work that we're doing with a subscription at ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. We depend on your subscriptions, and we are grateful to all of our supporters. And so check it out. It's free for 30 days. We'd love to have you join our growing community of readers. Once again, Cobus will be back with me again next week. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.